September 14th, 1971. A construction site in downtown Kansas City, Missouri. The morning air carried the smell of wet cement as trucks from Ready Mixed Concrete Company lined up along Broadway, their drums rotating slowly, waiting to pour the foundation for what would become another office tower in the city's expanding skyline. The foreman checked his clipboard, counting the trucks, knowing that every cubic yard of concrete delivered to this site had been approved by men who would never set foot on the construction grounds. The building inspector had already signed off on permits that morning, and the union steward had made sure the right workers were on the job. No one asked questions. No one needed to. In Kansas City, if you wanted to build anything taller than a garage, you went through one man first. Nick Civella did not look like someone who controlled an entire city's infrastructure. Short, stocky, with dark-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a neighborhood accountant, he operated from the Villa Capri, an Italian restaurant on North Kansas City's Armour Road, where he held court every afternoon at a corner booth. The Villa Capri was not a flashy establishment. Its parking lot filled with Cadillacs and Lincolns, its dining room perpetually half-empty except for the table where Civella sat with his underboss Carl DeLuna and his brother Carl Cork Civella. Law enforcement knew the Villa Capri. They photographed everyone who walked through its doors. They knew that decisions made at that corner booth determined which construction companies won city contracts, which union locals stayed cooperative, and which concrete suppliers got calls from developers. Civella's empire had not been built overnight. In the late 1940s, the Kansas City crime family had been fractured and weakened by internal conflicts and federal prosecutions that had scattered its leadership. When Civella emerged as boss in the early 1960s, he inherited an organization that controlled gambling and loan sharking but lacked the institutional power of families in New York or Chicago. He understood that street-level rackets were vulnerable, that bookmaking operations could be raided and numbers runners could be arrested. What Civella wanted was something more permanent, something embedded so deeply into the city's economic structure that removing it would require tearing down Kansas City itself. He found it in concrete. Ready Mixed Concrete Company became the cornerstone of Civella's operation, not through direct ownership, but through relationships that made ownership irrelevant. The company supplied the majority of concrete for commercial construction in Kansas City and the surrounding counties. Through carefully placed allies in the Laborers Union Local 264 and the Teamsters, Civella ensured that any developer who wanted to build in Kansas City used Ready Mixed or faced crippling delays. Union workers would slow down. Permits would stall. Building inspectors would find code violations that required expensive fixes. The message was always delivered quietly, usually through intermediaries who explained that using the right concrete supplier would make problems disappear. The beauty of the system was its invisibility. There were no broken windows, no threats shouted in alleyways, no bodies left in parking lots. A developer would receive a phone call from a union representative suggesting that a particular concrete company offered the best service and reliability. A city official would mention during a permit review that certain suppliers had excellent track records with the building department. The construction industry learned to read these signals. Ready Mixed Concrete became the default choice not because its product was superior, but because choosing anyone else invited complications that could delay a project for months and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Civella's control extended beyond concrete itself. He had influence over the Teamsters locals that controlled trucking, which meant he could affect the delivery of steel, lumber, and equipment to construction sites. He had connections to city officials who controlled zoning and permits. He had relationships with the politicians who awarded public construction contracts. A single decision made at the Villa Capri could determine whether a hospital expansion moved forward or a shopping center ever broke ground. Developers who cooperated found their projects moving smoothly through the bureaucratic maze. Those who resisted found themselves navigating an endless series of obstacles, each one seemingly unrelated to the last, until they either gave up or learned to make the right phone calls. The money flowing through this system was enormous and difficult to trace. Concrete companies charged legitimate prices for their products, but those prices included invisible premiums that funded the organization. Union pension funds made loans to mob-connected businesses at favorable rates. Construction companies hired labor brokers who kicked back portions of their fees. City contracts were awarded to the lowest bidders, who happened to be companies that understood the need for certain off-the-books payments. The entire structure operated as a kind of tax on development itself, a percentage of every building project in Kansas City that flowed upward through layers of legitimate businesses until it reached the men sitting in the Villa Capri. Federal agents and local police knew what Civella had built, but knowing and proving were different problems. Ready-mixed concrete was a legitimate business. Union officials were elected by their members. City officials followed proper procurement procedures. There were no ledgers documenting extortion payments, no contracts outlining the terms of protection rackets. Civella rarely met directly with the people who paid into his system. Intermediaries handled the actual conversations, and those intermediaries could always claim they were simply offering business advice or making friendly suggestions. Even when the FBI placed listening devices in locations where Civella met with his associates, they captured conversations that were carefully vague, references to unnamed individuals and unspecified problems that made sense to the participants but provided no concrete evidence of criminal conspiracy. By the early 1970s, Civella had achieved something rare in American organized crime. He controlled an entire city's construction industry without appearing to control anything at all. His name appeared in no corporate filings. He held no union positions. He collected no paychecks from construction companies. Yet every major building project in Kansas City required his tacit approval, and the money generated by this arrangement provided the Kansas City family with a stable, ongoing revenue stream that supported its traditional rackets and funded its expansion into new territories. But Civella wanted more. The construction racket was profitable and relatively safe, but it was limited to Kansas City and the immediate region. The real money, the transformational wealth that could elevate the Kansas City family to the level of New York's Five Families or Chicago's Outfit, existed in Las Vegas. The casinos generated cash flows that dwarfed anything happening in Missouri, and by the mid-1970s, Civella had identified a way to tap into those flows. His plan would eventually involve multiple families, hidden ownership stakes, and a skimming operation that would funnel millions of dollars away from Nevada gaming regulators and into mob coffers across the country. The same principles that had worked in Kansas City, hidden control, legitimate fronts, trusted intermediaries, would be applied on a much larger scale. What Civella did not yet know was that the FBI had begun assembling a case against him that would take years to complete, but would eventually expose the entire structure he had built. Federal agents had learned from their failures in previous investigations. They understood now that catching Civella required patience, surveillance technology that could penetrate his security measures, and witnesses willing to testify about systems they had participated in. The concrete empire seemed impregnable in 1971, its foundations set as firmly as the buildings it helped construct. But empires built on hidden arrangements and silent partnerships were vulnerable in ways that Civella had not fully considered. The same invisibility that protected his construction racket would make it difficult to defend when federal prosecutors finally found the right witnesses and the right evidence to bring the entire operation into public view. April 7, 1979. The count room at the Tropicana Hotel and Casino, Las Vegas. In the windowless room behind the casino floor, money moved through counting machines in stacks of 20s, 50s, and 100s, the bills sorted and verified by employees who had performed this ritual thousands of times. The official count would be recorded in ledgers that Nevada gaming regulators would review, numbers that determined tax obligations and ownership distributions. But before those numbers were finalized, certain adjustments occurred. A portion of the cash never made it into the official tally. Skimmed bills were separated, placed into canvas bags, and removed from the casino through service exits where they would begin a journey that ended in Kansas City, Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee. The system had been operating for years with mechanical efficiency, generating millions of dollars that never appeared on any balance sheet. Joe Agosto, the casino's entertainment director, oversaw this process with the attention to detail that had made him valuable to Nick Civella and the other families who had secretly gained control of the Tropicana's operations. Agosto did not fit the stereotype of a mob associate. Thin, well-dressed, with the smooth manner of a legitimate casino executive, he had spent years cultivating relationships with Nevada gaming officials and maintaining the appearance of running a clean operation. His official role involved booking entertainment acts and managing the casino's showroom, responsibilities he performed competently enough to avoid suspicion. His actual role involved coordinating the skim and ensuring that the cash reached the right people in the right cities. He answered to Carl Thomas, a St. Louis attorney who represented the hidden mob interests in the Tropicana, and through Thomas, he ultimately answered to Civella in Kansas City. The Tropicana was only one component of what federal investigators would later call the Strawman operation, a reference to the front men who held gaming licenses while organized crime maintained actual control. The Stardust Hotel and Casino represented the crown jewel of the scheme. Larger than the Tropicana and generating even more cash, the Stardust had been under mob influence since the 1960s, when Cleveland and Chicago families had arranged for Frank Rosenthal to run its operations. Rosenthal, a professional gambler and oddsmaker who had been banned from holding a gaming license due to his criminal associations, operated the casino anyway under various titles that allowed him to avoid direct regulatory scrutiny. His loyalty was to Chicago, but the skim from the Stardust enriched multiple families in a carefully negotiated arrangement that prevented conflicts over territory. The Fremont Hotel and Casino completed the trio of properties that fueled the Strawman operation. Smaller than the Stardust or Tropicana, but strategically located in downtown Las Vegas, the Fremont generated steady cash flow that supplemented the larger schemes happening elsewhere. The families involved had learned from the mistakes of earlier Las Vegas operations. Previous skimming schemes had collapsed when participants became greedy or careless, when disputes over money led to violence that attracted federal attention. The Strawman operation succeeded because it was organized like a corporation, with defined percentages, scheduled distributions, and a hierarchy that enforced discipline. Civella's role in the Las Vegas operation extended beyond simply receiving money. Kansas City held significant influence over the entire scheme, a position Civella had secured through strategic alliances and his reputation for maintaining order. When disputes arose over skim percentages or distribution schedules, representatives from the involved families would meet to negotiate solutions, and Civella's voice carried weight in those discussions. His concrete empire in Kansas City provided him with a power base that commanded respect, and his ability to move large amounts of cash through legitimate-appearing construction businesses made him valuable to the other families who needed help laundering their casino profits. The FBI had been aware of mob involvement in Las Vegas casinos for decades, but proving it required more than surveillance photographs and informant reports. Gaming regulators could document financial irregularities, but connecting those irregularities to specific organized crime figures required evidence that could survive courtroom scrutiny. The breakthrough came not from a single investigation, but from multiple federal efforts that gradually converged. Wiretaps placed on Civella's associates in Kansas City captured conversations about Las Vegas operations. Surveillance of the Tropicana documented unusual patterns in how cash moved through the casino. Financial analysis revealed that certain Las Vegas properties consistently reported earnings that seemed inconsistent with their actual business volume. Joe Agosto became the weak point in an otherwise secure operation. By 1980, he was under intense pressure from federal investigators who had accumulated enough evidence to indict him on charges related to the skim. He faced a choice that countless mob associates before him had confronted: accept a long prison sentence and maintain his silence, or cooperate with federal prosecutors and provide testimony that could dismantle the entire Strawman network. Unlike the soldiers and capos who had taken that same deal in previous investigations, Agosto possessed detailed knowledge of how the skim actually worked, who controlled which casinos, where the money went, and which public officials had been corrupted to allow the operation to continue. Agosto chose cooperation. His decision was not immediate or impulsive. Federal prosecutors spent months negotiating the terms of his testimony, offering him witness protection and reduced charges in exchange for complete disclosure. When he finally agreed, the information he provided went beyond what investigators had suspected. He named names, identified meetings, explained financial arrangements, and detailed a conspiracy that involved multiple crime families and extended across several states. His testimony would form the foundation for the largest organized crime prosecution in Kansas City history, a case that would put Civella and his entire leadership structure on trial. The indictments came down in 1983, a sweeping set of charges under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act that targeted not just the Las Vegas skim, but the entire infrastructure Civella had built in Kansas City. Federal prosecutors had connected the concrete racket to the casino operation, demonstrating how Civella used his control over construction to generate the wealth and power that allowed him to participate in the Las Vegas scheme. The trial revealed a criminal enterprise that had operated for more than 2 decades, touching every aspect of Kansas City's economy and extending into one of the most heavily regulated industries in the country. Civella did not live to see the end of his trial. Diagnosed with cancer, he died in March 1983 before the jury reached its verdict. His death did not stop the prosecution. Carl DeLuna, his underboss, and other key members of the Kansas City family were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. The testimony from Agosto and other cooperating witnesses dismantled the carefully constructed walls of legitimate business that had protected the organization. Ready-mixed concrete's connections to the mob were exposed. Union officials were indicted. The political relationships that had allowed Civella to control construction permits and city contracts were severed as officials rushed to distance themselves from the investigation. The Las Vegas convictions were even more devastating. Multiple defendants from Chicago, Cleveland, and Milwaukee were convicted alongside the Kansas City leadership. The Tropicana, Stardust, and Fremont all underwent complete ownership changes as Nevada gaming regulators forced out anyone connected to the skim. The era of hidden mob control over major Las Vegas casinos effectively ended, replaced by corporate ownership structures that made infiltration far more difficult. The Kansas City family never recovered. With Civella dead and his top lieutenants in federal prison, the organization fractured into competing factions. The concrete monopoly collapsed as federal oversight and new city regulations made it impossible to maintain the old system of hidden control. The new generation of developers and construction companies operated without the interference that had defined the industry for 2 decades. The Villa Capri closed, its corner booth where Civella had once directed an empire sitting empty before the building was eventually torn down. The Strawman case became a model for federal prosecutions of organized crime, demonstrating how patient investigation and witness cooperation could expose networks that had seemed untouchable. But it also revealed a fundamental vulnerability in mob operations that relied on legitimate business fronts and hidden partnerships. Those arrangements required trust, secrecy, and loyalty from participants who understood they would face severe consequences if they cooperated with authorities. When that loyalty broke, when a single critical witness like Joe Agosto decided that cooperation was preferable to prison, the entire structure became exposed. Civella had built an empire on invisible control, on relationships that existed in handshakes and quiet conversations rather than written contracts. When federal prosecutors finally forced those relationships into the light, when they compelled witnesses to explain on the record how the system actually worked, the invisibility that had protected the operation for so long became the very thing that made it indefensible.